The mansion stood where the road ended, as if the land itself refused to go any farther. Ivy strangled its stone walls, roots cracking the steps, shutters hanging like broken ribs. People in the nearby town passed it without looking, but everyone knew its name even if they never spoke it aloud. The Harrington house. It had been empty for more than 40 years, yet no one believed it was truly abandoned. When the door finally gave way, it did not creak. It sighed. Dust rose like a held breath released. The air inside was cold, colder than the evening outside, carrying the smell of rot, old perfume, and something faintly metallic. Footsteps echoed across the tiled floor of the entrance hall, where a chandelier lay shattered beneath the ceiling, its crystals dulled by time. Portraits lined the walls, their eyes darkened, faces cracked. One painting remained strangely untouched. A young woman in a white dress, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes staring just past the viewer. Her name had been Eleanor Harrington. Long before the mansion became a carcass for vines and rumors, it had been alive with sound. Horses in the stable, silverware clinking, laughter forced and hollow. Eleanor had been born during a storm so violent it split an oak tree in the yard. Her mother died before morning. From that moment, whispers followed the child like a shadow. Some said she never cried. Others said she cried for days and then never again. As Eleanor grew, the whispers hardened into certainty. She spoke to empty rooms. She laughed at nothing. She stood for hours at the edge of the fields, watching the slaves work, her head tilted as if listening to voices no one else could hear. The doctor called it nerves. The preacher called it possession. Her father, Master Thomas Harrington, called it inconvenience. He tried to fix her the only way men like him believed anything could be fixed. He corrected her posture, her tone, her silence. When that failed, he isolated her. When isolation failed, he tried to marry her off. Suitors came once, then never returned. Some claimed she watched them sleep without blinking. One swore she whispered his dead brother's name though no one knew of it. Another left before supper, pale and shaking, refusing to explain. Soon the invitations stopped. The town decided. Eleanor Harrington was mad. Master Harrington's patience thinned into rage. A mad daughter was a stain, a weakness, a thing that invited laughter. He could not sell her, could not marry her, could not lock her away without questions. Every solution collapsed into the same wall, until his eyes turned toward the fields. Among the slaves, there was one everyone feared and respected in equal measure. Elijah, taller than most, broad-shouldered, scarred by years of labor and punishment that never broke his spine. He spoke little, watched everything. Overseers hesitated before striking him. Other slaves stepped aside when he passed. Strength clung to him like a second skin. The idea came quietly, like a sinful thought that refused to leave. If no white man would take Eleanor, then she would be given to someone who could control her. Someone beneath notice. Someone whose voice would never be heard. The night the decision was made, Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase, listening. She always listened. Her father's voice carried through the house, sharp and final. Elijah's voice did not rise. It did not beg. It simply stopped. When the house fell silent, Eleanor smiled. That was the first secret the mansion swallowed. The arrangement was never spoken of as marriage. Not in the way the word was used in the house or the town. There was no dress chosen with care, no guests, no prayers offered for happiness. It was called a solution. A correction. Something to be done quietly, like burying an animal too sick to save. Elijah was told at dawn. The overseer did not meet his eyes. He read the order as if it were a list of supplies, his voice flat, his hands trembling just enough to betray fear. Elijah listened without interrupting. When it was finished, he nodded once. That single motion carried more weight than any refusal could have. Refusal was a luxury no slave possessed. Eleanor was told an hour later. Her father did not soften his voice. He did not explain. He said the words as if they were punishment being passed down by God himself. She would belong to Elijah now. She would leave the main house. She would obey. This was for her own good. For the family's honor. For silence. Eleanor did not scream. She did not cry. She asked one question. her voice calm, almost curious. Will he be afraid of me too? Master Harrington struck her for that. The sound echoed through the hallway, sharp and humiliating. Eleanor did not flinch. She only touched her lip where blood had appeared and smiled, small and private, as if the blow had confirmed something she already knew. They moved her into the old carriage house at the edge of the property, half-rotted and long unused. It smelled of mold and animals. A single bed was dragged inside. A chair. Nothing else. The door did not lock from the inside. Elijah arrived at dusk. He stood in the doorway, filling it completely, his shadow stretching across the dirt floor and crawling up the walls. Eleanor sat on the bed, her hands folded the same way they were in the portrait that would one day haunt the mansion. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Elijah stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I won't hurt you," he said. Eleanor tilted her head. "Everyone says that." He did not answer. He moved to the far wall and sat on the floor, back straight, eyes forward, as if waiting for orders that never came. The silence thickened, pressing against Eleanor's ears. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear his. Slow, controlled, alive. "You're not afraid," she said. "No," Elijah replied. Then, after a moment, "But I'm careful." That made her laugh. Not loudly, not wildly, just a soft sound, like something breaking gently. That night, nothing happened. And that, somehow, frightened the house more than screams ever could have. Days passed. The plantation watched. Whispers moved faster than footsteps. Some expected violence. Others expected death. Instead, there was only strangeness. Eleanor began walking the grounds again, always near Elijah, never touching him, never straying far. Slaves avoided her gaze. Overseers pretended she did not exist. Master Harrington refused to look in her direction at all. At night, lights appeared in the carriage house long after candles elsewhere had burned out. Sometimes voices were heard, sometimes laughter, sometimes silence so deep it made men uneasy. Elijah noticed changes first. Animals avoided the building. Dogs whimpered and pulled at their chains. A rat trap snapped shut with nothing inside. Once, he woke to find Eleanor standing over him, watching his face as he slept. "You talk to them too," she said. "To who?" he asked. "The ones that don't forgive," she replied, and lay back down as if that settled the matter. Elijah began to understand then. Not madness, not in the way the world used the word. Eleanor heard things that had reason to speak. The house, the land, the dead who had never been given names. And they were very angry. The first death came on a Sunday. The overseer slipped near the well, broke his neck on stone worn smooth by years of use. An accident, they said. God's will. Eleanor watched the body being carried away, her expression unreadable. "That wasn't me," she whispered to Elijah. "I know," he said. But the ground beneath the mansion had begun to remember everything it was forced to hold. After the overseer's death, the plantation changed its breathing. People still worked, still shouted commands, still laughed at the right moments, but something beneath it all tightened, like a fist closing slowly. Eyes lingered longer on shadows. Doors were shut more carefully. Even Master Harrington's voice lost its sharpness, as if he feared the house might be listening. Eleanor felt it immediately. "They're waking up," she said one evening as she sat on the carriage house steps, bare feet pressed into the dirt. Elijah was repairing a broken hinge, his hands steady, his movements precise. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew. She placed her palm flat against the ground. "The ones who were pushed down. The ones who were told to be quiet forever." Elijah said nothing. He had felt it too, a low vibration in his bones at night, a sense of being watched not by eyes, but by memory itself. Master Harrington refused to acknowledge the death beyond ordering the well sealed. He blamed carelessness, drink, fate. Anything but the land, anything but his daughter. Yet he could not stop himself from watching the carriage house from the upper windows, his face pale, his hands trembling when he thought no one saw. Then the horses began to panic. One broke its leg without cause, screaming until it had to be put down. Another refused to enter the stable, eyes rolling white, foam dripping from its mouth. The stable boy swore he heard a woman humming from inside the empty stalls. He quit that same day and left town by morning. At night, Eleanor spoke more. Not loudly, not to Elijah, to the corners, to the dark places where the walls met the floor. Sometimes she whispered names Elijah had never heard before. Sometimes she cried, silent tears sliding down her face while her mouth smiled. "You don't have to listen," she told him once. "But you do anyway." "I listen," he said, "because ignoring pain doesn't make it disappear." She studied him then, truly studied him, as if seeing him not as the strongest slave, not as the thing her father had given her, but as something solid in a world that kept slipping sideways. "You're not like them," she said. "I know," he replied. The second death was not an accident. It was Master Harrington's younger son, Caleb. Drunk, angry, careless in the way only those raised without consequences could be. He stormed into the carriage house one night, shouting accusations, threats, filth. Elijah stood between him and Eleanor without touching him. Caleb fell backward. That was all anyone could say for certain. He fell. His head struck the stone threshold. His neck twisted at an impossible angle. Eleanor stood over the body, her white nightgown soaked dark at the hem from blood and earth. "They told him to step back," she said calmly when people came running. He didn't listen. Master Harrington screamed that it was murder. That it was Elijah. That it was Eleanor. That it was sin itself made flesh. But his voice broke halfway through, collapsing into sobs that made the crowd uncomfortable. Nothing could be proven. Nothing ever could. After that, the mansion stopped pretending to sleep. Doors opened on their own. Footsteps crossed empty halls. The portrait of Eleanor cracked down the center, splitting her face cleanly in two. Servants refused to enter certain rooms. Slaves whispered prayers not taught by any preacher. Elijah knew then that whatever had been buried beneath the Harrington house was rising, and Eleanor was not its master. She was its door. One night, as rain battered the roof and lightning carved the sky into pieces, Eleanor took Elijah's hand for the first time. Her grip was cold, but steady. "They want justice," she said. "Not mercy." Elijah squeezed her hand once. "Then let them have it." From the mansion, a scream tore through the storm, long and final, and this time, no one dared to call it imagination. By the third day after Master Harrington vanished, the mansion no longer felt owned. It stood the same, brick, stone, wrought, memory, but something essential had been stripped away, like a brand burned off flesh. People approached it cautiously now, not as property, not as power, but as a thing that might decide for itself what it allowed near. Eleanor felt lighter. She walked through the front doors for the first time since childhood, her footsteps echoing in the vast entrance hall. Dust rose with each step, glittering briefly in the light before settling again, like reluctant witnesses. Elijah followed a pace behind her, alert, watchful, though he sensed the house no longer wished him harm. "They don't push anymore," Eleanor said quietly. "They just watch." The portraits along the walls had changed. Hairline cracks split faces. Eyes darkened. One canvas, her mother's, had collapsed inward, the frame twisted as if something inside it had tried to escape. Eleanor did not look away. In the study, the air was colder. Papers lay scattered where Master Harrington had left them, deeds and ledgers yellowed with age, ink smeared by moisture that should not have been there. The desk chair was overturned. The fireplace was filled with ash that smelled faintly of iron. Elijah knelt and touched the floor. "Something opened here," he said. "Something deep." Eleanor nodded. "That's where he went." She did not sound pleased. She did not sound afraid. Only certain. Outside, the plantation unraveled quickly. Overseers packed their belongings and left before sunset, muttering prayers over their shoulders. The remaining slaves gathered in quiet groups, speaking in low voices about roads, about rivers, about places where names could be chosen instead of assigned. Freedom hovered like a storm that hadn't yet broken. But not everyone fled. Caleb's body had been buried hastily, without ceremony, without a marker. 3 nights later, the grave collapsed inward. No remains were found. The earth was smooth, as if nothing had ever been placed there at all. That was when panic truly set in. A small group of townsmen arrived with rifles and lanterns, led by the same preacher who had fled days earlier. They stood at the edge of the property, refusing to cross the line where the grass grew darker. "This land is damned," the preacher shouted. "That woman is a vessel. That slave is her accomplice." Eleanor stepped forward before Elijah could stop her. "You were quiet when we screamed," she said calmly. "You were quiet when children disappeared into the ground. Why speak now?" The preacher raised his Bible. His hands shook. "You must leave." Eleanor smiled. "We already have." The wind rose suddenly, cold and sharp, blowing out half the lanterns at once. The men stumbled back, fear breaking their formation. From the mansion, a deep sound rolled outward, not a voice, not a scream, but the settling of something ancient and heavy into place. The men ran. That night, Eleanor and Elijah packed what little they owned. She took nothing from the house except one object, the cracked portrait of herself. She wrapped it carefully in cloth, her fingers gentle. "Why keep it?" Elijah asked. "So I remember who they tried to make me," she said. "And who they failed to." Before dawn, they left the plantation together, walking down the same road that once ended at the mansion. Behind them, the Harrington house groaned softly, beams shifting, walls sighing inward as if finally allowed to rest. Years later, travelers would claim the road bends away from that place now, as if the land itself refuses to lead anyone back. And beneath the ruins, deep below stone and root, the ground holds its silence, not empty, not peaceful, but full. Full of names that were finally heard. They did not look back when the road curved. Mist clung low to the ground, swallowing their footsteps almost as soon as they were made. By the time the sun rose, the Harrington plantation was already beginning to feel like something imagined rather than escaped. Still, Eleanor could feel it inside her chest, a dull echo, like a bell that had been struck once and would never fully stop ringing. "They won't follow," she said quietly. Elijah adjusted the bundle on his shoulder. "People follow fear more than truth. They're afraid of the wrong thing," she replied. They walked for 2 days before reaching the river. Along the way, Eleanor noticed things she never had before. The sound of birds returning at dusk, the way trees leaned toward light instead of away from it, the absence of whispers pressing against her skull. For the first time in her life, the silence did not feel crowded. At the river crossing, they met others. Runaways at first, cautious, eyes sharp, hands never far from weapons or flight. Word had already begun to travel, not as rumor, but as pressure. Something had happened at Harrington. Something final. The ground itself had swallowed a master whole. No one spoke it plainly, but everyone felt its weight. Some recognized Elijah. "The strong one," a man whispered. "The one they couldn't break." Elijah did not correct him. They built a camp on higher ground, temporary at first, then slowly more certain. Fires burned. Food was shared. Names were spoken aloud and repeated until they stuck. Eleanor sat apart at night, listening, not to the dead now, but to the living. Their pain had a different sound. It demanded action, not remembrance. Yet the past was not finished with her. On the 7th night, the dreams returned. She stood once more in the mansion hallway, portraits watching, floors slick with something darker than shadow. Beneath her feet, the house breathed. This time, however, the voices were not angry. They were afraid. "They're digging," the voices murmured. "They want us quiet again." Eleanor woke with a gasp, heart pounding. Elijah was awake instantly. "What is it?" "They won't leave it alone," she said. "The land. The truth. They're coming back." 3 days later, proof arrived. A rider from town, pale and shaking, stopped at the edge of the camp. He would not dismount. He would not drink the water offered to him. "They're tearing it down," he said. "The mansion, brick by brick. They say if nothing stands, nothing can haunt." Eleanor closed her eyes. "They never learn," she whispered. That night, the river ran darker than usual. Fish floated to the surface, bellies white. The ground trembled faintly, miles away, like something resisting being silenced a second time. Elijah stood beside Eleanor at the water's edge. "You don't have to go back." "I know," she said. "But it will follow if I don't." She turned to face him, her eyes steady, clear, no trace of the girl they had called mad. "I was the door," she said. "Now I have to be the lock." From far away, beyond forest and field, a sound rolled through the earth, the cracking of stone, the anger of memory disturbed. Eleanor stepped toward the darkness, and the night leaned in to listen. She did not wake the camp. She did not pack more than she could carry in one hand. The cracked portrait stayed behind, leaning against a tree where the firelight had warmed it the night before. Elijah watched her go anyway. He always did. Some bonds did not need words or promises. "Come back," he said, not as an order, not as hope, but as fact. She nodded once and disappeared into the trees. The closer she drew to the old land, the louder the ground became. Not voices, never voices now, but pressure. A tightening, like breath held too long. When she reached the edge of the former plantation, she found men already at work. Wagons loaded with brick, axes biting into beams, dust clouds rising where walls were being pulled apart. The mansion was screaming without sound. Eleanor stepped onto the soil and felt it shudder beneath her bare feet. The men did not see her at first. They were laughing, calling out to one another, congratulating themselves on bravery. One spat on the ground and said the curse would end before sundown. She walked straight through them. Tools rusted mid-swing. A rope snapped. One man fell to his knees, clutching his ears, blood trickling from his nose. Another dropped his axe and ran, screaming that the walls were bleeding. Only when Eleanor reached the front steps, half collapsed, stone split wide like a jaw, did they truly see her. "It's her," someone whispered. "The mad one." Eleanor placed her palm against the broken stone. "Enough," she said, not to them, but to what waited beneath. The earth answered. The ground sank inward, not violently, but deliberately, like something opening its eye. The remaining walls of the mansion groaned and folded down into themselves, bricks sliding into the dark as if being pulled by invisible hands. Men fled, tripping over each other, leaving wagons and tools behind. In moments, there was nothing left standing. Only a wide, silent hollow in the earth, smooth and dark, breathing slowly. Eleanor knelt at its edge. The pressure in her chest eased for the first time since she could remember. "I kept my word," she whispered. The land settled. By the time Elijah arrived, having followed the feeling rather than the path, the place was quiet. Too quiet. Birds circled again. The air smelled clean, washed of iron and rot. Eleanor stood alone at the edge of the hollow, her dress dusty, her face pale but calm. "It's done," she said. Elijah looked at the empty space where a house had once dominated the land, where power had fed itself for generations. "Is it?" She nodded. "They're sealed, not buried, remembered. They did not stay." Years passed. The hollow filled with rainwater, then reeds, then trees. No road ever led there again. Maps showed empty space. Children born nearby grew uneasy if they wandered too close, turning away without knowing why. Eleanor and Elijah moved often. They helped where they could. They listened. They told stories, not of ghosts, but of truth. Of what happens when pain is ignored long enough to learn how to speak. Sometimes, at night, Eleanor still felt the echo in her chest. But it was quiet now. And far away, beneath roots and stone, the ground held its silence, not hungry, not angry, just awake. It faded the way rot does when it's finally cut away, not suddenly, but completely. Farms were reclaimed by forest. Roads shifted. Towns found new histories to tell themselves, cleaner ones. Yet certain nights still carried weight, and certain places resisted being settled, as if the land itself refused to be owned again. Eleanor and Elijah lived between those places. They were known by different names depending on where they stayed. He worked with his hands, building, repairing, teaching others how to make something that would last. She listened, always listening, not to the dead anymore, but to the cracks where pain still leaked through the world. They became quiet warnings. In one town, a man who beat his workers began waking to find his floors soaked with muddy footprints leading nowhere. He changed, or he fled. In another, a woman who sold children vanished on a foggy morning, her house collapsing inward as if eaten from below. No one asked questions too loudly. Elijah noticed Eleanor growing thinner. Not weak, never weak, but stretched, like a wire pulled too tight for too long. Some nights she woke gasping, clutching her chest, eyes unfocused. They still reach, she admitted once. Not from that place. From others. Hurt calls to hurt. You don't have to answer every call, Elijah said. She smiled sadly. I know. But some doors don't close unless someone stands in them. The breaking point came in a river town swollen with greed and sickness. Children disappeared there. Women went missing. The ground stank of secrets. Eleanor felt it the moment they arrived, the old pressure returning, sharper this time. This land did not want remembrance. It wanted blood. That night, Eleanor walked alone to the riverbank. The water was black, unmoving, reflecting no stars. She stepped into it, dress soaking, cold biting her legs. Elijah, she whispered, not aloud, but deep inside. He woke as if struck and ran. By the time he reached the river, the ground was trembling. The water began to churn, rising unnaturally, dragging screams up from beneath its surface. The town woke to chaos. Buildings cracked, boats tore free, people fled without understanding why. Eleanor stood waist deep in the river, arms outstretched, her face calm and distant, like the girl in the old portrait. Elijah, she called this time. He reached her, grabbing her shoulders. Stop. This one isn't yours alone. For the first time, she hesitated. The river surged higher, wine tearing at them, voices pressing at Eleanor's skull, angrier than any she had known. I can hold it, she said, though doubt cracked her voice. You shouldn't have to, Elijah replied. He pulled her back, step by step, anchoring her to the shore, to him, to the living world. The ground fought them, shaking violently, but slowly, reluctantly, it eased. The river dropped. The screaming faded into distant echoes. Eleanor collapsed, sobbing, not in madness, not in fear, but in exhaustion. They left the town before sunrise. By morning, people spoke of a flood scare, of strange dreams, of nothing proven. For weeks after, Eleanor could not hear anything beyond her own heartbeat. She thought she had lost the gift. Elijah knew better. Some doors, once held long enough, learned to stay closed on their own. And somewhere far behind them, the river town learned to fear the dark beneath its streets, even if it never understood why. At first, Eleanor welcomed it. She slept without dreams. She woke without that familiar pressure behind her eyes. The world felt flatter, quieter, almost ordinary. They settled near a stretch of high land where the soil was clean and the nights smelled of pine instead of rot. Elijah built a small house with his own hands. Solid, simple, real. For the first time, Eleanor learned what peace felt like. And that frightened her more than the voices ever had. Because peace, she realized, was fragile. One evening, as autumn crept in and the leaves began to die politely instead of screaming their way into the ground, Eleanor noticed something wrong. The wind had stopped mid-breath. Birds froze on branches. Even Elijah, mid-step, felt suddenly distant, as if the air itself had thickened. Then she heard it, not from below, from above, a pressure, inverted, like memory trying to fall instead of rise. She staggered, gripping the doorframe. Elijah was at her side instantly. "They're back?" he asked. She shook her head slowly, eyes unfocused. "No, this is different." The silence cracked. A sound like fabric tearing echoed through the sky, and the world shuddered, not violently, but wrong, as if reality had briefly forgotten its shape. Eleanor dropped to her knees, gasping. "It's not the land," she whispered. "It's people." Images flooded her mind uninvited. Men gathering in secret rooms, hands stained with ink and blood, papers signed that erased lives, chains not of iron, but of law and silence. Pain was no longer buried in soil, it was being stacked, organized, hidden in plain sight. "They learned," she said, horror blooming in her chest. "They learned how to bury it without ground." Elijah felt it then too, not as visions, but as instinct. "Then what do we do?" Eleanor looked up at him, tears cutting clean paths down her face. "The same thing. We listen. We refuse to forget. That night, the silence broke completely. Not into screams, but into whispers carried on the wind, slipping through walls, traveling along roads, riding inside people who thought they were alone. Eleanor could hear them all now, not loud, not demanding, but persistent. Remember me. Say my name. Don't let this become normal. Eleanor understood then that her gift had not faded. It had changed. She was no longer a door. She was an echo. They began to move again, but differently this time. They did not wait for the ground to shake or the walls to bleed. Eleanor spoke to people before pain hardened into history. Elijah stood beside her, unmovable, a living reminder that strength did not belong to those who claimed it. Sometimes they were believed, often they were not, but seeds were planted. Years later, when fires burned through corrupt halls and truths surfaced that had never touched soil, people would say it felt inevitable. As if the world itself had decided to remember. Eleanor would feel those moments from miles away, a soft release, like a knot loosening. At night, she sometimes dreamed of the mansion, not as it was, but as empty land beneath stars. No house, no screams, just ground, waiting not to be fed again. And far away, wherever cruelty tried to settle in and call itself order, the silence would tighten slightly, as if something was listening. As if something always had been. Years slipped past like days, then days stretched thin as years. Eleanor's hair silvered early, though her face did not age the way others did. Elijah grew slower in his movements but heavier in presence, like an old tree whose roots only deepen with time. People who met them rarely remembered their faces clearly, only how they felt afterward, unsettled, thoughtful, unable to look away from certain truths ever again. History began to bend. Stories surfaced that had been buried too well to belong to chance. Documents appeared where none should have existed. Bones were found beneath buildings that had never officially been built on graves. Names long erased resurfaced in courtrooms, churches, family records. Some called it coincidence, others called it reckoning. Eleanor felt each one, not as pain anymore, but as release. It's spreading, she told Elijah one winter night as snow fell without sound. Not through fear, through remembering. That lasts longer, he said. But the cost was not gone. There came a night when Eleanor did not wake. Her breathing slowed, shallow and uneven, her skin cold beneath Elijah's hands. Panic, old, sharp, unwanted, cut through him. He had faced men with whips, guns, power, death itself without blinking. This frightened him more than all of it combined. She stirred just before dawn. "I'm not dying," she whispered, reading his face without opening her eyes. "I'm thinning." He frowned. "Explain." "I was never meant to carry this forever," she said. "I was shaped by one place. One wound. But now the world is learning to speak for itself." She finally looked at him then, her eyes clear and impossibly calm. "I'm becoming unnecessary." The thought broke something in him. "You saved people." "We did," she corrected gently. "Together." Spring came late that year. When it did, Eleanor could no longer hear individual whispers. Only patterns, movements, tides shifting beneath the surface of the world. She spent long hours sitting beneath trees, palm pressed to bark instead of soil, listening to life instead of death. One evening, she handed Elijah a small bundle. Inside was the cracked portrait. "I kept it," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "Now it's yours." He didn't ask why. He already understood. The next morning, Eleanor walked alone into the forest. Not running, not fading, simply stepping out of a role she had never chosen but had fulfilled completely. The air shimmered briefly where she passed, like heat above stone, and then she was gone. Elijah waited 3 days. On the 4th, he felt it, not absence, but balance. The world settling into itself without resistance. Pain still existed, cruelty still tried to root. But something fundamental had shifted. Memory no longer needed a voice. It had become instinct. Elijah lived many more years. He told stories when asked. He worked land that welcomed him. When he died, it was quietly, beneath open sky, with no ground shaking, no voices calling. Only peace. Long after, Travelers passing through forgotten regions would sometimes feel it, a sudden heaviness, a pause in the air, a sense of being observed by something ancient and patient. Not a warning, a reminder, that nothing truly buried ever stays silent, and that once, long ago, a woman they called mad taught the world how to listen. No stone, no cross, no whispered prayer left behind to anchor her to a single point on the earth. The forest closed gently around the space, leaves knitting together as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. And yet, the ground remembered, not as a wound, but as a lesson. Years folded into decades. Elijah's story survived longer than his name. People spoke of a tall man who appeared when things grew cruel and left once they began to change. Some said he was a ghost. Others said he was a warning that learned how to walk. The truth, as always, was quieter. What endured most was the feeling. In towns where injustice tried to root itself too deeply, nights grew uneasy. Papers refused to burn. Walls cracked in places no hammer touched. Children asked questions adults could not answer without shame. It was never dramatic, never obvious, just enough pressure to make forgetting uncomfortable. Historians would later argue over patterns. They would note how certain estates failed without clear reason, how families built on silence collapsed generation by generation, how land once soaked in suffering resisted being owned again, crops failing for men who tried to rule it the old way, flourishing only when worked with care. No one would connect all the dots. They never do. Far from the old plantation, a woman once dreamed of a house she had never seen. In the dream, it sank gently into the ground, not in anger, but in relief. She woke with a name on her lips, one she had never learned, and spent the rest of her life refusing to stay silent when harm wore respectable clothes. In another place, a man felt a hand on his shoulder as he raised his own to strike someone weaker. There was no one there when he turned around. He lowered his arm anyway and never quite understood why. These were not miracles. They were echoes. The world did not become just. It never does. But it became less comfortable for cruelty. Memory slipped into the cracks where law and power tried to seal it out. And every time someone chose to listen instead of dismiss, to remember instead of bury, the echo strengthened. If you walk long enough, far enough from roads meant to lead nowhere, you might feel it yourself. A pause, a wait, not fear, recognition, as if the earth beneath your feet is asking a single, quiet question. Will you pretend you don't hear me? Some answer yes, many always will, but some stop, some listen, and that is enough, because long after the mansion fell, long after the names were almost lost, the darkest secret it ever held was no longer hidden in walls or bones or land. It lived openly now. That injustice remembers, and it waits.